Okay, it's time to do possibly the most dangerous thing you can do on YouTube. It's time to talk about South Africa rugby. Are we prepared?
I'm scared, but I'm willing to stand 10 toes on whatever I say here. If you come for me, just know that I'm right.
All right, here we go. So, Rassie Erasmus named his training squad as our Southern Hemisphere expert. What are we looking out for?
Well, I think the first thing to address is that Rassie, surprised to no one, named 11 uncapped players. We know that Rassie is a World Cup winning man. He won't let losing the odd game here and there get in the way of those World Cup dreams. So this is his time to blood some new players, and that's what he's doing. There were two names that I've seen pop up a lot during the season as someone who's not able to watch the URC or the Challenge Cup that much because of time difference issues. And that was Sia Masuku and Sasha Feinberg Nomezulu. I think that's right. Someone correct me. I'll admit to being wrong in that instance.
That was pretty solid.
What have you seen of them from watching, I guess, the URC this season? And what do you have much intel? I need to know what I'm working with.
So Masuku, I haven't watched much of Sharks in the URC, but in the Challenge Cup, he has looked really, really good. Flawless kicking is the main thing. And, in light of the Stormers just went out of the URC and Manny Lebok missed 10 points off the tee. I'd say 8 of them were bad misses. I think you can forgive him the conversion out wide. But so in light of that, having one of these ice cold kickers available so that you could have a backup to Andre Pollard who can also score threes. So you don't have to have him available if you want to win matches that way. Surely, if he doesn't get good time in the jersey in the summer, I'd be really, really surprised. He looks pretty great. He gave such a funny post-match interview. They beat Clermont in the semis, and Clermont were ahead for a while, and then the Sharks kind of pulled their way back into the super South African, 10 minutes on the clock, and it's like, all right, lads, we're going to play now.
Right.
And they just went and destroyed them in the end. And you could see in his post-match interview, he was just like, oh, I'm living the dream. And he just couldn't get over it. It was such a wholesome moment. It was lovely. And then he kept swearing as well, which was great. So I think definitely he'll be involved. And then Sasha Feinberg, I'm not going to attempt the last name, I'm sorry. He, Casual Bias, and one of the other creators we're sort of in the orbit with, loves this guy. Second coming of Damien Willemse is what he said. And I have to say, watching him, you can see why, because he's got so much to offer. Really reliable player, definitely a bit of X factor. He can kick goals if you need him to. He just seems like one of those. Springboks love those utility backs, right? If you can play 15, you can play in the center. I think he can play 10 as well. So he just seems perfectly in the mold for the Rassie Erasmus style of rugby. And he's looked really good for the Stormers when I've seen him.
Wow. Okay. So those are the two I think I'll be keeping my eyes on for sure. I think as well, interesting and important to note that they're playing Wales prior to Ireland, and that's going to fall outside that kind of international fixture window. So we're not going to see some of the big powerhouses that we're used to seeing who are currently playing in Europe. So your Andre Pollards, your Sia Khaleesi is not there as well. It's a really interesting question around what happens with the captaincy. We know how important that kind of leadership role is to the South African team, being able to kind of stir the emotion and lead the team by actions, but also I think by words in their setup. So I'll be super interested to see what they do with that. Obviously, Bongi's had a go captaining the team. Who else do you think would be in the mix?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think who else is. You'd think Etzebeth, but he gets yellow carded a lot. I don't know if you want to risk a captain who spends. I suppose it never stopped New Zealand and Sam Cane.
I was about to say, don't tell me about that.
I don't know, but Bongi seems like the obvious one, right? It's a good question. Is Peter Steph du Toit, is he that sort of a guy, or is he more of a quiet leader?
He gives me I'm not saying words, I'm just going to smash people, which would is probably fine for the South African team.
What about Malcolm Marx? He's back.
That's my pick. My pick. I'm obsessed with Malcolm Marx. I think he's the ultimate. I would follow that man into war. He is so great. So yeah, him returning is obviously amazing after such a gutting injury in the World Cup. That was probably the saddest thing I think in the World Cup that happened.
Yeah.
Like I was so sad that he wasn't there. It would have made some of those matchups even better. But yeah, him returning probably puts his name in the ring for the captaincy.
Could work really well with the 6-2, couldn't it? Because if you're going to replace the entire pack and just whoever starts out of Bongi and Marks as captain for the first half, and then whoever comes on as captain for the second half, and then you're set.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Unless Rassie surprises us all and he goes back to like a regular 5-3 split on the bench from this year onwards.
Yeah, well, it feels like he always wants to zig when people think he's going to zag, right? So I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you know what? While we're on Rassie, do you detect his hand in all of this, all of these media comments that are stirring up the rivalry ahead of the series? What do you think?
I think if not his hand, definitely his tutelage, right?
Yeah.
Like straight out of the textbook. Obviously, we've had what? Who was it? Damien Dialende the other day. We had Peter Steph du Toit. There's been a bunch of them. Obviously, a lot of them with Jim Hamilton. So World Rugby approved, shall we say.
Did you see Zebo on Kickoffs and Kick-Ons?
Oh, I haven't listened to it yet. I saw he was on, though.
They asked him about Damien Dialende, and he's like, yeah, God, Rassie really hates the Irish.
I think that's a worst kept secret in World Rugby at the moment. It's great for the stirring up the emotion straight from the PR book. Like it's getting people interested. It's like a new rivalry, right? Like the All Blacks and South African rivalry, you could lean on history, whereas this one is like pure hatred and disrespect and like in recent times. And so much of it, even in these interviews, I think they were saying it's not just about the rugby, it's about like what happened when South Africa were pitching to host the World Cup and Europe voting for France and all this stuff. So it runs deeper than I think we thought. And I think the players, I don't know if Rassie's told them to do it, but I think they know what would make him really happy.
How much of it do you think is like a Michael Jordan thing of where, because they've won 2 World Cups in a row, right? They're like on top of the world. How much of it is like you have to keep inventing stuff when you're leading the pack? Because basically every time you go out there, it's everyone else's biggest game of the year, right? You're the world champions, double world champions. So how much of it is that you just have to keep inventing like slights and giving your players a reason to be really angry?
Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah, I think so much of the Springbok's game and Springbok's success has been down to emotion, right? And that's what Rassie does really well, is being able to give the players, we've all seen that clip from Chasing the Sun, right? Like imagine this is your family, you know, going in to make a tackle. So undoubtedly, I think he knows that he needs to string a new narrative to bring aboard all of his players, particularly those who maybe, you know, if they're heading into their 3rd World Cup cycle, you know, they've heard it all before. So we've got to do something and refresh it. I've always wanted to ask someone who's a captain, like, how do you give your halftime speech, your pre-game speech, and not feel like an idiot who's just recycling the same thing? Like, do you come up with something new every time? Because undoubtedly you've given so many and you've heard so many, and how many are just the same thing? Yeah. So props to Rassie. I love a bit of a PR game. So I do wonder how much the Irish media have learnt their lesson, though, if at all. Do you think?
I mean, what I think it's actually, this is a boring answer, but off the ball are the ones who he really hates, right? Like they're the ones that he was showing in Chasing the Sun when they were talking about steroid problems in South African rugby. And like they definitely at the time, their strategy was badmouth South African rugby to get clicks because that kind of stuff performs really well online. But now they've gated all their content. It's all subscription now. So if they're saying stuff about the South Africans that Rassie doesn't like, he's going to have to pay for it if he wants to see it. Because it's not available.
The South African Rugby Union, like paying for that, like writing it off on tax.
I could 1000% see him subscribing just so he could get the information to get. I saw a great clip of Handré Pollard yesterday talking about like back in the old days, one of Rassie's moves was that he used to print off sheets with fake line out details on them. And then he'd leave them in the dressing room after the captain's run, because he said the home team, they would do the captain's run in the morning and then the away team would come do the captain's run in the afternoon, and he'd leave them like under benches and stuff so it looked like someone had dropped a sheet. And then they'd go and they'd do the pre-game warm-up the next day, and he'd be watching them, and he could see if they'd fallen for it or not. And then they'd run the real line-out calls in the game. Like, just classic shithouse. You have to love it.
The shithousery knows no bounds. And like, it's the same reason I respect Eddie Jones, like, in a way. I don't know if respect. I enjoy Eddie Jones because like you're giving me so much. What do you reckon Rassie Erasmus's pseudonym would be to sign in for off the ball subscription content?
I don't think he'd be able to hide himself very well. I think you'd be able to see pretty clearly. He'd
be in the comments.
And actually, on the rivalry, I wanted to ask as well, and I know we talked about this a little bit with New Zealand and England as well, but I think it's way more stark with South Africa and Ireland. South Africa have nothing to lose on this tour. They've got a bunch of injuries. They've just won the World Cup. For Ireland, it feels like they have to win at least one test, or else everybody's going to be talking about how they're chokers and bottlers and all this kind of stuff. Like, the narrative will just continue. Like, what do you reckon about that?
I think it's super interesting because there were even conversations just after the World Cup that Ireland would maybe send like a development kind of squad, and they'd just go and just do it, get the tour over with and blood some new players. And very quickly, because of the intensity of, I guess, the media storm and the rivalry, that is not going to be the case. And I think it's only intensified through the URC. Like, has that played a big factor as well, having these little mini matchups in the lead up?
I think so. And also the fact that the South African teams and the Irish teams, with the exception of Glasgow, no disrespect meant to Glasgow, but the body of the South African teams and the Irish teams are the best teams in the league, right? So that definitely adds an extra level to it. But I couldn't believe it when people were talking about that. You know how many test matches Ireland have won in South Africa in history? One. Yeah, one. The one where CJ Stander knocked out Pat Lambie. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So not overshadowed by a sad events on the day. But that's the only game that's the first time we won a test match there. So to talk about sending a development squad is just, it's crazy.
And that would have riled the South Africans up too. Like, they would have been like, that's disrespectful.
Yeah.
So that would have been a terrible idea, I imagine. But the rivalry we're seeing, I think it's cool to see the development of a new era rivalry in rugby. We're not just relying on these old tropes. And so with the, I guess, rise in the rankings for Ireland comes a rise in rivalries, and people are seeing them as big dogs to take down. I wouldn't discount that the satisfaction that the Springboks would get, despite not really having anything to lose, they would love nothing more than to just pummel the Irish.
To beat us with potentially Colby missing and Aronson missing and all these big name players missing, if they beat us, we'd never hit the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, on Colby, is there a curse happening at the Suntory Sun Goliath in Japan? Because obviously Cheslin Colby's now out injured. Sam Cane was playing for them alongside Cheslin Colby. He hasn't played since February. He's not going to be available for selection in England. So I don't know who the strength and conditioning coach is over there, but I've got some questions.
Shots fired. So South Africa now have this Ireland rivalry in the Northern Hemisphere, and they're reigniting the rivalry with New Zealand in the Southern Hemisphere with the return of proper test series every 4 years. What's the down south view on that?
I think everyone's really excited about the return of those proper tours. You've heard players everywhere in New Zealand saying they really miss traveling to South Africa, and that when you were like a young gun coming up and going on a tour to South Africa, that was like nothing you could ever experience. You learned so much about yourself. But I also think in theory, because the South Africans are like the back-to-back world champions at this point, world number one at the moment, they've won 4 World Cups, the most of any nation. It's kind of like when you go to a pub quiz and there's like a team that you see every week that doesn't know that you're in competition with them, but they are your biggest rivals. It's kind of like that. Everyone's like, those guys, that's our biggest test. But South Africa are just like, we're up the top. So, it's going to be competition at every turn. Like thinking about the All Blacks matchups against the South Africans this year in South Africa, like it's mouth-watering. It's so good. So they are the pinnacle at the moment. They're the threshold, they're the standard. And I think they'll love being in that position. No one more than Rassie.
Yeah, and they love being in that position and then still experimenting. Like that is the thing that I'm always the most impressed by looking at them. Like they don't allow the fact that they're world number one or world champions to stop them from just trying stuff, trying new players. Like so many coaches are so reticent to try inexperienced players in big games, and you can see why, because like the risks are there. But South Africa just do it, like they just go for it.
Yeah, and going hell for leather is part of the brand, and doing the unexpected is part of the brand. So I think being able to see, I guess in 2023, we saw what we thought was a fully realized, the pinnacle South African Springbok team who did the thing that they set out to do. So what more can Rassie produce? The question of what that looks like is super exciting for World Rugby, and he's always at the front of innovation. So yeah, is all good, and the best teams should be.
We hope you enjoyed that clip from Coast to Coast with me and Ella.
Make sure to hit the like button, the subscribe button. If you're on TikTok, we're both there. Andy, you're at
Rugby Nose.
And I am at Ella Ferguson 5. Catch you next time.